之际发动这类攻击。美国大使馆指出，俄罗斯在乌克兰的攻击行动持续对平民和民用基础设施构成威胁。星期三是乌克兰摆脱苏联统治并获得独立31周年，同时也是俄罗斯入侵乌克兰满6个月。在频频的警告声中，基辅取消了庆祝独立日的公开庆祝活动。乌克兰军队总司令星期一表示，自从俄罗斯2月24号入侵乌克兰以来，乌克兰有将近9000名军人阵亡。联合国指出，俄乌战争已经证实造成了超过5500名平民丧生。美国说，正在认真审议伊朗对欧盟一项旨在恢复2015年核协议的建议的最新反应。美国对伊朗似乎放弃把伊朗革命卫队从美国海外恐怖组织名单上去除等没有意义的要求感到鼓舞。国务院发言人普莱斯在星期一的简报中说，这是一项协议现在要比2个星期前更为接近的部分原因。但这些正在进行的讨论结果依然不确定，因为分歧依然存在。普莱斯说，美方内部磋商一旦完成，以及与紧密盟友的磋商一旦完成，就会对伊朗的反应做出回应。他说，有关美国拖延了这次谈判的说法是不真实的。伊朗指责美国拖延了恢复所谓联合全面行动计划协议，以换取解除制裁的间接谈判。美国苹果公司一名前华裔工程师星期一在加州的一家法庭对有关他窃取公司商业机密的指控做出了有罪申辩。检察官指控2015年到苹果公司工作的张小朗窃取公司自动驾驶汽车研发项目的机密信息，并将这些信息提供给一家中国竞争对手。苹果公司对此人展开调查，通过追踪软件和闭路电视摄像机，公司获得了他犯罪的证据。2018年7月，张小朗持单程机票，准备从加州圣何塞机场飞往中国时被逮捕。预计法庭将在今年的11月对张小朗作出判刑裁决，他面临最多10年监禁和25万美元罚款。美国和其他13个印太国家下个月将在洛杉矶举行印太经济框架部长级会议。美国贸易代表办公室和美国商务部星期二发表声明说，会议将于9月8号到9号举行，由美国贸易代表戴奇和美国商务部长雷蒙多主持。会议将继续就贸易、供应链、清洁能源、税收和反腐等议题进行积极讨论与磋商。这是这项经济倡议今年5月启动以来的首次面对面部长级会议。该会议将进一步推动拜登政府深化该地区经济联系的努力，被认为旨在抗衡中国不断增加的地区影响力。这项经济倡议目前的14个成员国包括美国、澳大利亚、文莱、斐济、印度、印度尼西亚、日本、韩国、马来西亚、新西兰、菲律宾、新加坡、泰国和越南。美国国务院常务副国务卿谢尔曼星期二上午会见中国驻美大使秦刚，重点讨论了台海议题。下面是美国之音驻国务院记者站主任张荣香的报道。
在美国国会众议院议长佩洛西访问台湾之后，美国国会参议院外交关系委员会亚太小组主席埃德马基、美国印第安纳州共和党籍州长艾瑞克·霍尔科姆等美国政要也相继访问台湾。中国连连在台湾周边实施前所未有的高强度军事演习，并且单方面切断与美国在军事、违禁药品管控和气候变化等领域上的合作。北京政府的反应是否和中共20大即将举行有关？对此，美国国务院发言人内德·普莱斯提出了说明。
That's really a question for the PRC, what they would point to in terms of what is unquestionably their aggressive and in many ways unprecedented provocations and military maneuvers in the Taiwan Straits and around the Taiwan Strait. For our part, we are monitoring things very closely. It is the PRC that has sought with its recent actions, but also with actions over the course of several years now to undermine the status quo that has been at the heart of that stability across the Taiwan Strait.
尽管美国与中国持续外交对峙，但两国之间依然能够通过派驻大使保持沟通。美国政府说，维护台海局势的稳定，符合美国与其亚太盟友的国家利益。
One of those important interests is stability across the Taiwan Strait. This is an important global crossroads. An enormous amount of global commerce passes through the Taiwan Strait over the course of some 4 decades now. The United States and our allies and partners in the region have stood up to defend and to preserve that status quo.
谢尔曼和秦刚会晤的其他议题还包括了美中大使馆、新冠病毒隔离措施以及对塔利班官员的旅行禁令等等。以上是美国之音驻国务院记者站主任张荣香的采访报道。
针对维吾尔人的强迫劳动议题，曾经担任民主人权劳工事务助理国务卿的波斯纳认为，防止强迫维吾尔人劳动需要欧盟、日本、澳大利亚等国采取类似美国的措施。来看详细内容。
The U.S. Customs and Border Protection has been implementing Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act since June. What does it mean that the U.S. is carrying out the act to prevent Uyghur forced labor? Would it work if other large economies such as the EU and Japan not having similar regulations? We know that the goods seized by U.S. Customs and Border Protection would be released to its exporter after a month. Would it happen that companies might ship those goods to other countries that don't have such regulations afterwards? How could this be avoided?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's all right. Enforcement of a law like this is always challenging. And undoubtedly, some companies are going to try to do just what you suggested. They're going to go and produce things and send them to a third country with the thought that they're going to eventually find their way into the United States. I think what's interesting to me is that there's also a debate now going on within the EU about following the U.S. lead. When the U.S. leads on something like this and does it so clearly and without much political debate. I mean, 406 members of the U.S. Congress voted for the Forced Labor Prevention Act, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. 406 members of the House of Representatives rarely vote for anything. And so there's a sense this is bipartisan. It's something that is very strongly held by the United States as a priority. And I think that will mean that other countries, the EU countries, perhaps Japan, Australia, are going to now look to say, should we be doing the same thing? Until they do, as you say, there are going to be other avenues for companies to export the materials from Xinjiang. And so we just have to take it one step at a time.
There might be some loopholes of the act that companies might be complicit of directly or indirectly. Or is it so broad that many U.S. companies would have to change their suppliers to a large extent?
One of the things that's interesting about the law, and it's quite strict in saying that there's a presumption that goods coming from either manufactured in Xinjiang or using raw materials, cotton or polysilicon from Xinjiang, there's a presumption of forced labor. So the burden is on the company importing things into the United States to overcome that presumption, which I think is very difficult, if not impossible, to do, because there's really no independent monitoring of labor conditions in Xinjiang. The government has prohibited independent groups like Verite or others to come into that region. And so I think a company is going to have a very hard time saying we do monitoring and we're sure there's no forced labor to overcome that presumption. I think the biggest challenges are going to be for companies that are using cotton in clothing production or textiles, and companies using silicon or polysilicon in solar panels. And so I think the real discussion is going to be going forward, how are those companies operating? And to my mind, they're going to have to change the way in which they do business to comply with the law.
Some analysts think there might be difficulties for companies to prove that there are no forced labor in their supply chain, and therefore the best way for them is to avoid cotton and tomato products from Xinjiang completely. But it may worsen the turmoil of the supply chain, which is not in a good shape right now, and it is a factor to cause inflation in the U.S. Do you think that there is a way to address the manufacturers' concerns?
I don't think it's possible to think about production, manufacturing of garments in China without addressing the question of where's the cotton coming from. Now, as you say, there's a balance. It means that there are certain economic consequences. If you can't produce in China, you have to go somewhere else to produce. You have to figure out Chinese cotton, Xinjiang cotton is also being exported to Vietnam, to Cambodia, to other places in Asia. So this is not an easy question for companies. I'm not for a minute thinking, oh, this is easy just to flip a switch and you can all of a sudden be in compliance. The other issue, which also is very much on the table with the solar panels, there's a environmental need to reduce carbon emissions. Solar panels are an alternative source of energy. Overwhelmingly, 90-some% of the solar panels manufactured coming into the United States are coming from China, and there's an essential element in Xinjiang province. And so, you know, you have to balance the interests. But I would say that Congress has spoken, the president has signed a law, and what needs to happen now is for the U.S. government and companies to begin thinking very creatively and ambitiously about finding alternatives.
Are you concerned about the possible disruption to green energy if there is a supply shortage from Xinjiang?
From my mind, it's important to both be concerned about our environmental footprint, reducing carbon emissions, and at the same time be concerned about the 1 million Uyghurs that I mentioned that are being detained in some form in Xinjiang province, the hundreds of thousands of people that are subject to forced labor. So we have to be mindful of both. You can't just say, okay, we're going to forget about human rights because we need to find alternative energy sources. You can't just say we're only going to focus on human rights without thinking about alternative ways to get solar panels or lithium or whatever into the supply chain. These are hard questions. I think both for companies and for government, these are questions that are going to require smart people to try to figure out how do you do both? How do you respect human rights, abide by the law, and at the same time find better ways, alternative ways to get solar panels and other alternative energy sources. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think importantly, we're now on a path where the human rights issues can no longer be ignored.
How do you see Uyghurs' situation in Xinjiang currently, seeing the mass surveillance, detention camps, labor camps, and genocide happening? Is the U.S. government taking urgent actions fast enough and effective enough? What else could be done to help Uyghur?
Well, I think on one level, certainly the rhetoric, the kind of public diplomacy has been very strong, both under the previous administration and under the current Biden administration. U.S. officials at the most senior level, including the president, have spoken out about the forced labor and all of the violations you described. Now, there's a lot of attention in the public domain, in the press. Congress is paying attention. So I think on one level, the issue has the issue is now at a much higher level in terms of public attention and profile. The question of what else can be done, I think, is to me the place we now need to focus. And I would say three things. One, as you suggested before, the United States acting alone is not enough. And so there needs to be, I think, greater attention to how do you bring the Japanese government, the Australian government, the EU, and other governments along to follow the U.S. lead and also have similar kinds of restrictions on imports coming from Xinjiang. If other big commercial countries with big economies follow suit, I think that puts greater and greater pressure on the Chinese government. Second thing I would say is we need to use, I think all of us collectively need to use the international organizations like the United Nations, the International Labor Organization. Chinese government is very active now in the international stage with organizations like the UN. And I think there's really a value in those organizations also speaking out. I think the Chinese government would pay attention to that. And then the third piece is the private sector. And again, our experience over the last several years is that the Chinese government will attack or criticize one company, try to put pressure on them. Other companies are terrified, we don't want to be next, and so they keep their head down. I think this is a moment where companies, let's say in the apparel industry or in the solar panel industry, need to come together with a common message and say to the Chinese government, we're now under pressure based on this new law to do something different. We need you to help us be able to continue manufacturing and producing products in China. So a combination of greater international attention among governments, the UN, and the private sector. All of those things, I think, need to be increased.
Xi Jinping has been in power for 10 years. Have you noticed any major changes in his policy toward Uyghur people recently with quite significant international pressure?
Well, I think we've all been, or people that I work with have been really frustrated, disappointed, especially I would say since maybe 2017. There's been a dramatic deterioration of rights. All of the things we're discussing, the detentions, the surveillance, the forced labor, all of that has accelerated tremendously in the last 5 years. And Xi Jinping seems determined to kind of take a hard line, a tough line. He's running for another 5-year term, as you say, and there'll be a party Congress, I guess, in the fall. But I'm not optimistic based on what we've seen in his first 10 years in power. He is not, I've been going to China since the early 90s, and I was in the U.S. government 10 years ago. There were moments where we were thinking, okay, we're starting to see some greater engagement and discussion about some of these issues. The door has been slammed shut. There's much less willingness to engage about things that I think are both in China's interest and the interest of the world. We do not have a healthy, open dialogue about human rights issues now under Xi Jinping's leadership, which is unfortunate. I think it's bad for China, it's bad for the world, and it's certainly bad for minority populations like the Uyghurs. Today, China's advanced unbelievably economically. The private sector has flourished over the last 30 or 40 years. The country's a very different place. But the government can't keep saying, we'll put off human rights and the protection of individual rights forever. Poverty has been greatly alleviated. And the theory was always, when we get to a place that we have greater economic resources, then we'll allow people to have free speech and free press, and we'll open up the political process. If anything, as I say, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, Xi Jinping has turned the clock backwards and has gone back to an earlier era where Chinese government was dug in and basically said, we're doing it our way. International human rights norms don't apply. And I think that's bad for China. It's bad for the Chinese people. And it's certainly bad for human rights.
当今真相为重，掌握全球脉动， 只要点击 VOA Plus， 手指移动，信息即来，追踪政治动向，体验真实生活，世界各地的声音，随时随地轻松获取。现在就下载 VOA Plus 应用程序 VOA Plus。
台湾军方近日展示其最先进战机 F-16V 夜间起飞，挂载美制先进中程空导弹、响尾蛇短程空导弹以及鱼叉反舰导弹的夜间制空及制海作战能力。台湾军方表示，中共军演是很好的练兵机会。来看报道。
The tension between the Taiwan Strait is getting higher, and it's obvious in knowing that. But that's still what we're training for, and it's what we're preparing for. So they come and we rise, and so our scramble jet will never stop, and we will stop their offender and outside our defense identity, outside our ADIZ.
我们对于中共在不断的在台海周边海空域来进行一些挑衅性的举动，破坏区域的和平，我们要表达谴责。但是我们也必须要说，维持我们的战备训练的强度，去确保以战备训练作为一个本务，这是我们军人的一个职责。所以中共现在所有采取的行动，正好提供了我们一个很好的一个练兵的机会。我们会把握这个机会，把我们平常所做的所有的战备训练来做一个验证。
俄罗斯对乌克兰的侵略导致大批历史文化遗产遭到破坏。现在，保护世界遗产的国际组织号召乌克兰民众将一些历史文化物质遗产用手机扫描，并转换成3D 数字模型，送入云储藏，以数字的方式长期保存，免遭俄罗斯炸弹的影响。
Our history is at risk, but there's another way to preserve it, forever. Backup Ukraine is a digital archive with 3D.
The fastest way to erase a people's national identity is by destroying their cultural heritage. So when we saw exactly that happen, we knew that we needed to do something, and we needed to do it fast. The breakthrough that we saw and that we utilized in launching this project is that now it's something that's done in the cloud by an algorithm, which means that everyday people using just their phones can make really precise 3D models at a level that was normally reserved for professionals with millions of dollars of equipment. So that power is now in the pocket of every Ukrainian.
We are reaching out now to everyone, potentially everyone with a mobile phone, and they can help protect their own cultural heritage. Not only the big monuments and what you have in the museums, but also what you find being important cultural heritage.
Зараз відбувається повномасштабне знищення української культури з боку Російської Федерації. Руйнуються історичні будівлі, пам'ятки, скульптури, спалюють книжки. Також зазнають руйнації церкви, яким більше ніж 1000 років. Та ми маємо зробити все можливе, щоб зберегти та передати майбутнім поколінням нашу спадщину.
格陵兰远在北极圈深处有一间米其林餐厅，那里的精致美食使用当地出产的肉类、海鲜以及各种天然的农产品为原料，烹饪出的菜肴呈现出近乎工艺品的精致。一起去看一看。
Try to focus on as much Greenlandic produce as possible. So, everything from Greenlandic halibut to snow crab to muskox to ptarmigan, some different herbs, different berries, and so on. So it's a long menu. So this is a ptarmigan. It's a local bird. We grill the breasts and then we serve it on the bone together with some mushrooms, some cured reindeer fat, and then we have almost like a salsa made from the different berries that the bird eats. We serve it as a little almost finger food. You just pick it up by the bone and eat straight off the bone. A very Greenlandic thing. Obviously, we do it in a little bit different way, but this is a whale. So in Greenland, it's called matak. It's the skin of the whale that they eat raw. So we've done it a little bit differently, where we have cut it into these cubes and folded it, and then we marinate it with currant leaf oil.
好了，以上就是今天美国观察的全部内容。今天也是我最后一次主持美国观察节目，感谢您一直以来的关注和陪伴，我们下次再见。
各位听众、观众好！新型冠状病毒疫情在